The night had settled thick and heavy over the dense forest, the kind of silence that presses against your ears and makes every sound sharper. Deep within the woods, miles away from the nearest road or town, a lone camper had set up their tent. The crackling fire flickered weakly, casting dancing shadows on the towering trees that stood like silent sentinels all around. The air was cold, the kind that seeps into your bones, and the only sounds were the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. But then, cutting through the stillness, came a howl. Not the howl of any wolf or coyote the camper had ever known. It was lower, more guttural, raw and full of something ancient and wrong. It echoed through the trees and seemed to wrap around the campsite like a living thing. The camper froze, heart pounding. The fire suddenly seemed too small, too weak to hold back the darkness pressing in. Minutes passed, the only noise now the crackle of burning wood and the soft padding of footsteps in the underbrush. Then, when the camper dared to look outside the tent, strange tracks caught their eye, large, oddly shaped prints pressed deep into the moist earth, unlike any animal they recognized. They circled close, weaving around the trees as if something had been stalking the campsite all along. Unease settled like a thick fog. The wind whispered through the branches, and the moon, hidden behind swift-moving clouds, seemed to dim. Eyes strained to catch any movement beyond the flickering light, searching for the source of that chilling presence. And then, through the shadows, a figure appeared. Not quite human, not quite beast. Its silhouette was blurred, limbs twisted unnaturally as it crouched low behind a tree. For a brief moment, two glowing amber eyes locked with the camper's, watchful, intelligent, and utterly alien. The figure melted back into the darkness, leaving behind only the oppressive feeling of being hunted. The night swallowed the camper whole, and the forest waited, silent but alive, with secrets lurking just beyond sight. The forest was alive with whispers, leaves trembling under an unseen breath as twilight melted into night. The camper, still shaken from the previous night's eerie encounter, moved cautiously through the dense undergrowth. Every shadow seemed to flicker with unnatural movement, every crack of a twig a signal of impending danger. The air grew colder, heavier, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. Then, from the corner of the camper's eye, a figure emerged, an unnatural silhouette shifting between forms. One moment it resembled a man, tall and gaunt, with limbs too long and twisted to belong to any ordinary human. The next, it morphed seamlessly into a creature that seemed half beast, half shadow. Its fur was patchy and wild, blending into the darkness like a living camouflage. But the most chilling feature was its eyes, glowing with an unearthly amber light, piercing through the gloom with a predator's focus. The figure moved with impossible speed and silence, sliding over the forest floor like smoke curling through cracks in a wall. No rustling leaves betrayed its presence. No sound gave warning. It was a ghost in flesh and fur, stalking its prey with cold, calculating intent. The camper's breath hitched in their throat. Panic fluttered like a trapped bird inside their chest as they ducked behind a gnarled tree trunk, hoping the shadows would keep them hidden. But the creature's gaze swept the area relentlessly. It was hunting, and the camper was the quarry. As the seconds stretched into unbearable silence, the camper's eyes darted around the dense woods, realizing the terrifying truth: they were not alone. The forest, once a place of solitude and peace, had turned into a living nightmare. Something ancient and malevolent was closing in, stalking them with a relentless hunger. The creature vanished suddenly, melting into the darkness as if it had never been there. But the sense of being watched, hunted, never left. The camper's heart thundered in their ears as they understood: the night held more than shadows. It held a predator, and it was very close. The night had thickened into a suffocating blackness, the kind that swallowed all light and hope. The camper, breath shallow and heart pounding, moved cautiously through the forest. Every step felt heavier than the last, weighed down by a creeping dread that twisted deep in their gut. The silence was no longer peaceful, it was oppressive, broken only by the distant crack of a snapped twig. Then, out of the darkness, a figure emerged. Not hidden, but bold and deliberate. The Skinwalker stood just beyond the faint glow of the camper's flashlight, its form shifting unnervingly between man and beast. Its eyes burned with a cruel intelligence, and a twisted smile curled on its lips, human enough to be recognizable, but monstrous enough to inspire paralyzing fear. Suddenly, a voice slipped from its throat, low and trembling, yet unmistakable. It was the voice of someone the camper loved, a voice from the past, warm and familiar. "Come closer," it whispered, each word dripping with deceit. The Skinwalker's voice was a cruel mockery, a twisted echo meant to lure its prey into a trap. The camper's breath caught, torn between disbelief and an overwhelming urge to run. But the creature's gaze held them frozen, its glowing eyes locking onto theirs like iron chains. Time slowed as the Skinwalker took a step forward, then another, closing the distance with unnatural grace. Desperation ignited inside the camper's chest. With a sudden burst of courage, they spun away, breaking into a frantic run through the tangled forest. Branches clawed at their skin, roots threatened to trip them, but the will to survive pushed them forward. Behind them, the creature's voice echoed one last time, cold and menacing, "They never forget you." The words hung in the air, chilling the camper's blood long after the footsteps faded. The night swallowed the fear-stricken figure as the forest seemed to pulse with a silent warning: some horrors don't just vanish. They linger. They remember. And they hunt again. The camper had thought the nightmare was over. After escaping the woods, they returned home, expecting safety, warmth, and the familiar comfort of walls that should protect. But some terrors don't stay confined to the forest. Some follow you, unseen, lurking just beyond the edges of reality. It began subtly at first. Soft whispers echoed in empty rooms, voices so faint they seemed part of the wind. Shadows flickered at the corner of their vision, shapes that vanished whenever they turned to look. Doors creaked open on their own, and cold spots chilled the air like breath from a long-forgotten grave. The camper remembered the stories they had once brushed off as myth. Skinwalkers, ancient, cursed beings, said to be witches with the power to take animal forms and prey on the living. They were forbidden, feared by those who knew the old ways. And unknowingly, the camper had trespassed into that dark world. Legends told of a curse. Once marked by a Skinwalker's presence, escape was not guaranteed. The creature's malice could follow, twisting reality and haunting dreams, feeding on fear. The camper's unease grew as the boundary between nightmare and reality blurred. One night, as rain hammered against the windows and lightning briefly illuminated the room, a shadow slipped across the wall. It wasn't just a trick of light, there was intelligence in its movement, a deliberate stalking. The camper's heart raced as they caught a glimpse of glowing amber eyes reflecting back from the darkness just beyond the glass. The house no longer felt like home. Every creak, every whisper was a reminder, the curse had followed them. The Skinwalker was near, watching, waiting. The camper knew this was only the beginning of a torment that would test their sanity and their will to survive. In the deep silence of the night, one truth echoed loud and clear: some curses never end. And some monsters don't stay in the woods. The night was thick with menace, the forest around the camper alive with an almost palpable hunger. After days of terror and narrow escapes, the camper knew they couldn't run forever. The Skinwalker was relentless, an ancient predator that stalked shadows and twisted fear into a weapon. But the camper had learned something in the dark hours: the old legends held power. Stories whispered by those who had faced these cursed beings before. Armed with this knowledge, the camper prepared their final stand. In a small clearing beneath twisted branches, they laid out salt in precise circles, gathered sacred sage for smoke, and arranged talismans crafted from bones and stones said to repel evil. Each movement was deliberate, an urgent dance of survival against a foe born of nightmares. The air crackled with tension as the first signs of the Skinwalker's approach stirred the leaves. Eyes gleamed in the darkness, and the silence shattered with a low, guttural growl. The creature lurched forward, shifting swiftly between man and beast, its form flickering like a nightmare come alive. The camper lit the sage, smoke swirling thick and fragrant, filling the air with a burning haze meant to cleanse and protect. They held their ground, chanting fragments of the ancient words, fighting fear with every breath. But the Skinwalker was cunning, circling, probing for a weakness. Then, in a sudden burst of speed, it lunged. The chase exploded into chaos, branches scraping skin, heavy breaths mingling with the crackling firelight, the desperate pulse of survival thrumming in every heartbeat. The camper sprinted through the dense forest, the talismans clutched tightly. Behind them, the creature's growls echoed, fading then returning like a dark echo in the night. Then, as the first light of dawn cracked through the trees, the forest fell eerily silent. The camper stopped, gasping, heart hammering, eyes scanning the shadows. There was no sign of the Skinwalker. Had it retreated, beaten by the rituals and fire? Or was it still out there, watching, waiting for the next moment to strike? The question lingered, heavy and unresolved, as the sun rose, illuminating the forest, but not banishing the darkness that lived just beyond.